Hello, this is Aaron Wissner with Local Future, and I am broadcasting live from Michigan with David Korowicz of Ireland, Dublin. Today he is going to present and share his presentation titled Systemic Risk and Decision-Making in a Disordering World. David is a humans systems ecologist working internationally in large-scale systemic risk and preparedness. David, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us.
Delighted to be here.
Is this a brand new presentation or can we find this elsewhere?
No, this is put together. I mean, there are bits that have been talked about elsewhere, but this is here.
All right. So everybody, if you could please welcome David and give him your full attention. This will probably be about a 40-minute presentation. If you're on live on YouTube with us, you can ask questions at the end, and I'll definitely do some follow-up questions afterwards with David. All right, take it away.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Well, I think it's very clear that this is probably the great intrusion into our collective psyche, the coronavirus and its ongoing effects throughout the world. In living memory, there has yet to be a crisis that so quickly has altered so much of the world. There are billions of people who are not working or have reduced working. There are disruptions to supply chains across the world. There are financial shocks spreading, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty, whether one is in lockdown or whether one is trying to come out of lockdown. It's very clear that this is something unfamiliar and, as I say, an intrusion into our psychic, social, and economic space. And it's also clear that it's illuminating something else. One is our connectedness, our collective vulnerability, both in terms of the structures of how we live, the supply chains, the financial systems, the economic systems, etc., and in how emerging risks like pandemics have been understood and that they've been growing. But this is really the first time we're seeing one of those shocks cascade through societal systems. So what we want to do here today is stand back a little bit and say, how do we understand our emerging world of risk? Because we know there's climate change out there happening. We know that there's biodiversity loss. We know there's polarization. We know that, all sorts of things are interacting. So, this is something new for us because it seems like so many parts are moving. How do we understand it? What are we saying about the world we're living in today? So a good place to start is to take a step back and look at, a bit about risk. Now, when we look at the future, our expectations of the future are past adaptive. That means from our experience, what we suppose will happen in the future is constructed. So there's a kid on the road and the kid looks out and sees, this is the path in which I'm on. But of course, we don't really know what's going to happen. Every moment is cast anew. So how can we orientate ourselves? How does a business orientate itself? How does this whole thing hang together? Well, it comes because we live within patterns that have been created in the past. Some are conscious, most are unconscious. So if we know there's certain things we need food, water, and we expect that, therefore, that tomorrow we can get money and go to the supermarket, that those things will be available, they will be there, that when we turn on the tap, there'll be water. All of these habitual assumptions are built in to our expectations of the future from now and the further we go into time. And they've been, honed out of experience. And when we look at risk, we can think of risk as, in one way of looking at it, is just the likelihood or chance of something happening. generally we see it as bad, but we could also see it as good. So it's the probability of something bad happening. And our experience of what might be bad coming in the future is largely shaped out of what's happened in the past. So we've lived in a relatively stable world for much of the United States, Europe. We haven't had war, etc. There have been buffetings, there's been little shocks, etc. But that's where expectations come from. If you were in parts of Southeast Asia, you would have known that because it's happened, that various pandemics were starting in the last 50, 100 years, and it was widely understood that Southeast Asia would be a source of a pandemic. So we see them better prepared. One would expect that the Southeast United States is better prepared for hurricanes because it's experienced hurricanes. Some of the countries in Africa that have had to deal with Ebola have been remarkably adept at dealing with the coronavirus because they have that expectation, those experience and skills. So when we look to a future as a society and we say, what's going to happen? Well, we might say that our professionals use analytical methodologies. So that might be things like when we're calculating home insurance, there is a whole treasury of historical experience of how often houses are robbed in particular places, are they burned down, or if you're looking for catastrophe insurance, for flooding, etc., that is built out of past experience. And those models and the premium you pay is a construction of the past. It's also our worldviews. So we've lived in a particular type of world, and collectively that shapes our view of what happens. Often it's intuitive, it's not necessarily explicit in our awareness, but we assume that after a crisis we recover. We assume that, when something bad happens, eventually what is the path to recovery? Because we've lived in that sort of world where there's a shock, there's a financial crisis in 2008-9, we expect recovery, for example. There are ideas such as when there is a crisis or when there's a problem, we say, well, we're an inventive people. We develop technologies and we use those technologies to surmount the problem, deal with the problem. And again, we have a huge experience of that, of saying, well, in the 1960s, there was worry that there'd be a global famine, because population was growing, and it seems that, the productivity of the earth could not give much more. And yet we had the Green Revolution. So fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, new seed varieties were collectively brought to bear onto global food production. And here we are with more than double the population, in seemingly a world of abundance. So we have this expectation that, climate crises, we'll build wind turbines and new types of grids, etc. So that's part of our worldviews. They're shaped by the past. And there's also the very structure of the world. So how our supply chains, our critical infrastructures, how all of these things are built and work, that reflects past conditions also. And we'll see a little bit more about that soon. And then, of course, we are a species. We are one of the species on the planet Earth. Who we are, both as individuals and especially because we're an ultra-social species, that is, emerged out of a long history. A lot of our behavior was shaped by scarcity and volatility when we were hunter-gatherers and deep into the past. So part of our behavior, so we like sweet and fat things. Well, they were good things to get when things were scarce, when we, when we lived as hunter-gatherers, these were precious things. It doesn't do us much good now because we have so much access to sweet and fat and all of that. But there's all sorts of behavioral traits that we have within us. Again, often subconscious, that reflect those past histories. So in the broad sense, we carry within us a risk perception of the world, be it professional, be it as people, be it as a society. Now, one of the things I suppose about us is, you can imagine some sort of bacteria that lives, has a life cycle of a few hours. Well, if bacteria could talk to each other, a day would seem like an age. And they would say, oh, it is always bright. A long time ago, they say there was a dark period. But their world would be circumscribed by their lives. And that's very much the same with us. If you look at this graph, you'll see the population of the Earth and per capita income. And that's really a measure of how rich we are. And in the x-axis, you'll see time going from 0 to almost today. And you'll see for a long time, not much seemed to change. It did, of course, in the little fluctuations, but really in the last 200 to 250 years, there's been this exponential explosion, both in population and income. So that has been broadly our experience. That's been that, few generations. That's what shaped, that experience has profoundly shaped how we think about the world, how we think about risk. So that's been the world where, every year we've been getting richer, every year the population has grown, every year it seems society is becoming more complex and integrated. But we should remember that when we look at this and ask ourselves, well, how would, if we were to stand back, how would we interpret it? Well, if we were to go back to the beginning of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and if you can imagine somewhere on Earth there is a family who are at the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago, and there's a newborn baby, and we're going to take that baby and swap it with a baby born just this moment in a Dublin hospital, New York hospital, or wherever. There's no reason to believe both the babies, the swapped babies, would not grow up to be normal members of the respective societies. We as individuals aren't more intelligent than they were 10,000 years ago. The difference in our worldview, in our society, is to do with the structure, the social, the economic world the children or the babies would have grown into. So we ask then, well, why did this inflection happen 200 years ago, 250 years ago? Is it because we became suddenly very intelligent? Well, no, because there's no fundamental difference in us individually. Of course, there's been complexifying of some degree, so we learned science, etc. But the real reason, or the fundamental reason behind it, is about 200, 250 years ago, we started to get on this cycle of growth. And when you think of any organization in nature, in our society, when you build and organize and sustain people, things, societies, ecosystems, it needs energy to flow through it. So energy enlivens and allows us to build and sustain complex organization. So the fossil fuel revolution is the reason that inflection happened. And as society became more complex, it could support more people, we were solving problems. We were connecting, and that allowed more people to work together. It allowed division of labor, so people could specialize, become more skilled in particular things. It allowed us to store and share information. It allowed us to connect and move resources more easily. Nobody had to stand over this. Nobody had to say, how will I design, just like today, how will I design this complex organization? It is what we'd say in system science, it is an emergent property of lots of people and organizations linking, interacting, sharing, but they do it within their own niche. The emergent structure, the collective structure, is beyond our understanding and control. And so there are two things we need to keep in mind. One is our views of the world and our expectations of the future and of risk are largely shaped by a very unusual period in human history. It's a kind of a freakish thing. So if we go back 10,000 years, beginning of agriculture, when we did our baby swap and realized we're all the same, well, what's happened, this inflection, is only the last 2% of that time. So it's a weird little thing. So that's our temporal myopia. We need to be able to realize that, we're building our expectations on something freakish and in human history terms, a very short period. The other is the illusion of control, that somehow this complex thing was designed. Just, this is a difficult thing for us often. In the 19th century, when I think George Paley sort of was giving an argument for God, he said, well, look, if you wandered and you found a watch, you would say, well, somebody must have designed and built it. Look at the organization, look at its structure and its delicacy. And he would say, well, same for humans and life. We look at this structure and delicacy, therefore somebody must have built it, therefore that person was God. And of course, what Darwin sort of illuminated and his successors is that, what nature does complex organization building. And that's, we see it in an ecosystem, and we've seen it as nature evolved. Became not only more species, but richer ecosystems with far more connections. So that's essentially what we have done through our interactions together and interactions through our resources and society and our nature and our ecosystem. So we've built this more and more complex system, but we don't understand it. It wasn't designed. We design it in parts with the emergent property that the whole is not in control. And here's a way of looking at it. So you have the world, for example, and the green is the environment. And in the middle, you have parts of what our complex society entails. So you can see that there's obviously human behavior and adaptation. Now, behavior is everything. Our collective behavior is institutions, that we understand money. These things aren't obvious. We emerge into them and we start to use them. But, if you gave money to somebody in a tribe off in the middle of nowhere, they wouldn't know what it meant by it, what it was for, what it would do. Even the number system isn't obvious. It had to be learned, invented, shared. So it's our institutions, our patterns of behavior, our expectations. So there's humans and our behavior. We rely on critical infrastructure. How we get the grid and the power. Imagine, our communications networks, our water in our cities, it needs production flows. That's the factories and the supply chains. Think of everything that comes into a business, into a supermarket, into all the bits that a piece of infrastructure needs. That's the flows of production through the world. You need a financial and monetary system. Well, that's kind of the other side. We give these strange tokens or digits on a computer screen. We work, we build things, we give these sort of digits, and somehow this system allows this whole global system to allow goods and services to circulate. So there are economies of scale. We couldn't live with the complexity of the world we live in now if it was all being done in one country. There are too much things need to be made, so much complexity, but also it wouldn't be affordable. So for example, I think in the United States or in Europe, we might be spending, say, 10% of our income on food. Imagine what would happen if suddenly we had to spend 50% of our income on food. Whole parts of the economy would collapse because we have to buy food. It'll push out other things. There'll be a total financial crisis because debts won't be paid, people won't have money, and it'll have all sorts of complex effects. So there's economies of scale that allow this complex world to happen. And of course, we mentioned that it needs energy, and of course it needs other resources. So we need an energy and resource infrastructure that interfaces with the environment, and that is how we get fuel, it's how we get minerals, it's how we get trees, it's how we get fertility from the land to grow food, it's our tractors and seeds and pesticides, it's our mining systems and all of that, that sort of interface. And then that feeds through to the rest of this. So wherever you are in the world, this could represent a country, it could represent the world. If it represents the country, you could see this sort of little picture and you can connect it to other countries, and you can see the connections through supply chains and information and financial flows, etc. So it's a way of seeing our contemporary world. And you can imagine when we saw this line growing in the last chapter of growing complexity and wealth, that this thing in the middle starts to complexify. There are more parts, more components, more interconnections. It starts to spin faster. It starts to, distribute itself globally so that it's in this reinforcing cycle. What do we mean by reinforcing cycle? Well, some is that human behavioral side of us. So you remember we said that, we share things from our past of scarcity, and one of the things we're interested in is status. We mightn't always be explicit about it, but one side of getting status is displaying your relative wealth. And lions do it, that's why they have the big dark mane, or peacocks do it with their spectacular tail, and humans do it sometimes with their house or their car, but it can be all sorts of subtle things as well. That's called, a sort of costly display. It shows to, potential mates and potential rivals that you are high status and therefore desirable, worth copying, etc. And, it tilts in terms of, saying, I am somebody worth mating with. So, so one side of this thing growing is, that side of, or of keeping up with the Joneses. And we're very sensitive. We don't like to admit it, but people are very sensitive to comparisons with, their own in-groups. So, but the other side is, part of what we're doing is, it's kind of like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. We got to adapt to stay still. So you can imagine, I decided I didn't want the internet back in the mid-90s. I said, I'm not having anything to do with this. I'm just going to go about my life living without it. This would be fine in the beginning. The internet is a new thing, it's whatever. But over time, the ability for me to operate in this society and get a job and feed my family, etc., would start to be more and more endangered by not getting the internet. Why? Because it starts to become a critical part of how society operates. So in a sense, I'm forced to adapt in order to, I have to move in order to stay still. And also, because we see this sort of change of, how jobs move to cities. Cities are, more efficient at many things. They draw in wealth. Jobs leave the country. These are big macro processes. You know, partially we might think we can control them, but there's also big, huge processes that are really happening that we're carried along in. I mightn't want to move to the city, but if the jobs in the country go and I need to survive, I might have to move to the city. So in many ways, a lot of these changes aren't somebody sits down and decides them. It's decisions are made due to local dynamic changing constraints. And that's true for countries as well. You know, we see this process of globalization, of movement of money and all of that. Well, you might say this is a terrible thing. This is bad politicians doing neoliberalism. But the other side is, well, it's more of, at a higher scale, it can also be seen as you need to change in order to persist, you know, to keep. So if you decided we're not going to trade anymore, you would fall down relative to other countries rather than, you know, not just increase your wealth, but you would have more and more difficulty paying for the things you need to import to kind of run your basic power or fuel or other things. So in many cases, you know, how society evolves is, you know, it's about how we adapt to dynamic constraints, if that makes sense. But of course, if you think about it, you know, if you are a modern car producer, you might have a just-in-time factory of 4,000 components to build a car like a Mini. Most of those components are literally coming directly onto the production line through very sophisticated just-in-time supply chains. And they come from companies that supply further companies. There are literally millions and billions as you go down the chain of connections. And those companies and factories in a myriad places require critical infrastructures to work. They require global financial systems, transport networks, communication networks, financial systems. And you say, wow, it's this whole complex thing that's all working and synchronized. And of course, if I want to buy a car, it means that I have money and the grid is going on here, so I can go into the car shop and I'm earning my money through my interaction with the world, through technologies and whatever. So we see this integrated world, and you kind of say, how does it all hang together? Yeah, it must be really stable. And that's an important thing, because, you know, if you're BMW and you've got 4,000 inputs into your factory, and all of those have inputs, if that's always breaking due to storms, social unrest, financial turmoil, it would never have evolved. You can't run a system, you know, if all of this just-in-time system of that complexity, if there's always breaks in somewhere in the chain where you barely know because it's so dispersed and so complex. So one of the things is this whole system, self-organized, to suppress volatility. And of course, one of the things when you suppress volatility is you can have shorter supply chains. You don't need big inventories. And of course, if you're in a competitive world where, you know, you need to keep your business profitable, but also relative to other businesses, you have to do what other people are doing and reduce your inventory to be viable, to be sustained. In other words, in order to persist, you have to adapt. And that forces you, or the direct, not much forces, but the current, the direction that pushes is tighter supply chains, tighter, shorter, more connected, more globally connected, more global integration. And of course, this is what we're seeing with a lot of the discussion around COVID and its breaks in supply chains, that we're discovering what we did know, but it wasn't popularly discussed, how vulnerable this was. But you know, people are saying, oh, well, we'll bring these supply chains home. Well, we can see already from what we've said, some of the reasons why that's difficult. Because the supply chain doesn't end in your factory. Your factory has to be supplied. You're all connected anyway into this delocalized, globalized world. So we see this world of growing complexity, growing integration, growing speed of processes, and we've become used to it. It is what we call normal. And the reason we really, we live in cities, for example, and we have clean water and sanitation. It's boring. And the reason we have that is there's sanitation equipment and filtering equipment and all of that. There's chemicals, and it's driven by the operation of the grid, and the grid is connected to other things, etc. But when these things work, we take them for granted and we don't see them. We don't need to see the complexity of our supply chains when they work. So it's like, we don't notice the ground until we trip. It's there, it's in the background of our lives, so we take it for granted. And the sphere of what we are, the world of what we notice is what's different or what changes or what is volatile. So even though we can say, wow, the world has changed so much, within all of that, there's been a continuity that allowed the growing complexification and allowed us to be ever more an integrated global world. And here's just an example of that. Now, what you're seeing here is the change in GDP every year, global GDP. And it's going from 1951 to, well, it's up to 2019, but I've just stuck an arrow down there to represent where we are probably going this year. And you kind of say, in a world so complex, with so many parts, isn't it amazing that how relatively stable it's been? So every year it grows by a certain percentage. Now, it sort of was slightly higher up until the early 1970s, but even since then, it's just a few percent variation. The biggest crisis until now barely broke 0% change. Now, of course, the interesting thing about this growth is it is exponential. So 3% growth each year is not the same bite. It's 3% on the year before, which was 3% bigger, etc. So every year we take a bigger bite of growth. And, as we see, that requires ever more energy and resources. And of course, as the system processes those energy and resources, it gives out waste. And that waste is in CO2, it's in the trash, it's in our polluted waters, it's in the ambient chemicals around us. So this faster and faster circulation of societal complexity has required exponential increases in energy and resources and exponential growth in waste running through it. So essentially, that is the process of civilization. So if we were to say, okay, let's stand back, say there is our interconnected global system. It is a type of organism. We don't control it, except in niches or parts. We don't really understand it. And yet it can do the amazing thing of hanging together, of operating, of allowing us to take for granted water, light, food, etc. And if we see it as a civilizational body, we can sort of say, well, each part is dependent upon all the other parts. So our welfare is delocalized. It's everywhere. So the basic things I need, food, water, shelter, depends on an unimaginable connectivity that spreads around the globe. And the same for all other parts, unless you are truly locally self-reliant. And we can see the danger of, say, disruption. There's a word we use in network science called centrality, which is just kind of, you can think of it as how critical one part is to the functioning of the rest of the network. So you could say the United States is very high centrality. If you lift it out, or if I put a wall around the United States now, the rest of the system would collapse. Why? Because supply chains are feeding its infrastructures. Financial systems are, keeping that relationship between trust, expectation, and productivity. That's part of what money does or finance does. There would be disruptions to critical inputs, etc. So we can see that this is part of the civilizational body side. Each part has a dependency with others, and many more parts are now critical. We know, you can imagine that oil is very critical, because we said energy is the driving force that allows complex organization to grow, to be sustained. But there's lots of others in regions. So we see it as a singular organism that can have a heart attack, or can have liver damage, or that can hurt a toe, but each in their own way, depending on their centrality, can hurt or disturb the whole operation of the whole. And civilization is also a constraint. So we depend upon the system we're in. So we might say, we would like to reorder the world to whatever end we want. Let's say we want to make it green, we want to make it equal, etc. But you have to start from where you are, because you actually rely upon the things and the integration working just to sustain yourself where you are and to do things. And as the system has grown in scale and connectivity, its connectivity and integration, you realize actually these constraints are profound. We actually don't have a lot of maneuverability if you want to keep the systems that we rely on operational. That doesn't mean that they can be sustained, but it means that change is really difficult. And part of the reason we don't often in culture and discussions about climate change, etc., aren't cognizant of that is largely because when the system worked, we didn't see it, and we could assume that we didn't see it, so it was easier to see change as pieces put together and pieces moved, rather than you're living in a vast, complex thing, that the bigger the change you want to do, the more the ripple effects become unpredictable and global. So in many cases, we can say we're locked into processes, because the processes that sustain our world, our lives at this moment, are also the processes that are undermining those systems, because we're damaging the world, we're using resources that are finite, etc. So we could say we've been in or growing into a bit of a quandary. We depend on more and more complex, globalized, delocalized systems, but they're the very same systems that will ultimately start to fragment or collapse because they become unsustainable. So if we were to look post-war and say, well, what would you expect in future? Well, you wouldn't have to even have a fancy economic model. You could just go by past experience, say, within 2 or 3%, or within 2%, 3%, I think economic growth next year will be 3%. And you're probably going to be right for decades and decades. And you'd probably also be able to say, well, welfare is probably going to get better. And by welfare, I mean things like shelter, clean water, access to education and healthcare. And certainly, while there have been growing stresses in some of the developed countries in terms of inequality, in terms of constraints on income, for much of the world, things have been improving over the last bunch of decades. So, and you certainly notice that if you're a parent and you realize that your children are dying from communicable diseases, diarrhea, etc., and you get clean water into your city or town, it's a huge thing. And that has been happening. So we've lived in a period of economic growth, really huge technological growth, interdependence, and it's been stable. That sort of picture we showed earlier on. And there was always, if you look at the graph, it's asymmetric. So there's only so much it would grow. We don't, well, China is different, but as a global system, it would be very unlikely we'd have 10% growth. So there's kind of a limit to how much growth, but there's not you can see though that, well, there could be recessions. So there's more of a tilt that things could be worse and even worse. And at the end down there, you see systemic failure. That's when this integrated system can fail, either at a local, regional, or even global scale. And there you could say, well, nuclear war would have been one of the things that you say, well, there's a likelihood, you see it there, of very big fall in GDP. We call systemic failure. That happens, nuclear war. But there's other things. If you remember, we talked about our temporal myopia, how we judge our world from a pretty narrow view of history. Well, we didn't have in that period, interestingly enough, and luckily enough, we didn't have a major global volcano that sort of really undermined global food production. But in 1815, Mount Tambora blew, and it was known as the year without a summer. And there were food shortages across the Northern Hemisphere. We haven't had something like that. We haven't had major solar storm. Now, there was one that became known as the Carrington event in 1851. So you can imagine a major solar storm hits the Earth's magnetic field, bashes through it, and starts to fry electric systems. So in 1851, damaged telegraph. You could see the aurora right down near the equator. But its effect on society wasn't huge. Why? Because we didn't have large-scale electrical dependencies. If it happened now, because we're so dependent upon electricity, the effect could be catastrophic. Because if you can think of it, if you pull out electricity, you have to take an imaginative walk of all the things that electricity is connected with: water, food, your money, all of these things, and you realize the extent of the crisis. So that was a new vulnerability due to our technologicalization, whereas the Mount Tambora example would have affected us at any time in our history. But we've been pretty lucky. But there's still risk. Nuclear war, there was always some likelihood of a major shock that could really damage us. Then, of course, pandemic, severe pandemic. And we've kind of habituated to it. It shapes our world and our politics. So, we have, I think, these expectations of politics now that have been, depending on where you are, but politicians are meant to solve our problems. We have these expectations of the world, and if the expectations aren't achieved, we give out to politics, and it is their job to, in some way, fix the problem. And really, that's a feature of stability, of low risk. But of course, one of the things about habituation, or that we heard habituation is, I think, we start to worry about other things. So there's always, humans have worriness in us. So even though in many cases things were getting better, we are who we are. We're, worried about relative status or inequalities or what we don't have, and then we take, other things for granted, food, water, etc. So, we've come from very unusual, freakish period in human history. But this is now changing. Now, this is complex, but I'm going to explain it. Why is it changing? Well, one is that complexity, that globalized interdependent world, that system is vulnerable, and it's becoming more vulnerable. We go over, we say that system, we've mentioned it before, is facing an increasing range and intensity of stressors. We looked at constraints, maybe to oil and food production and water, the effects of climate change, and within society, growing polarization, growing stresses within the financial system. So there are multiple stresses that are increasing in their intensity, and they're interacting. So let's go first to the growing systemic vulnerability. Well, delocalization, that we mentioned, that we depend everywhere, any place depends on the operation of things everywhere else. Well, that means shocks can spread. It even means that if there's a big enough shock, even if it's somewhere else, it can start to take down other parts of the global civilization or the global organism. There's synchronization, the way everything held together so tightly, so interdependently, means that, if you start mismatching things, if there's breakages, they can spread. Same with complexity. They can spread, propagate, and cascade. And Liebig's law is just an example of how they can do that non-linearly. Liebig's law is, we mentioned the company has 4,000 inputs. If they're all essential, so you can't make the Mini without the steering wheel, even if you have everything else, it doesn't become a sellable product. If you lose one critical input, the whole thing is stopped. That's Liebig's law of the minimum. And you can see it if you break something here, and it causes another output, which is an input to something else, and it's how disruptions can spread. And of course, it's not just inputs of goods, it's inputs of people's skills and services, of all of these other things. So it's very prone to, if it's a big enough shock, to be sort of cascading disruptions. Growing stressors interact through those. So you can imagine more extreme events, more multiple failures. So we're going to use some examples now to make this clearer. And a good place to start is the pandemic. The pandemic is part of that increasing range and intensity of stressors because it comes from our interface with the natural world in various ways. It has caused, connected through global flights and the ease of global transport, is now really everywhere. The economic responses, the societal responses to it, the health and then the economic responses have caused this global shock. So if you were in, for example, one thing it's going to say, if you're in Algeria, you realize that one of the big things you've earned your income from, oil, has collapsed in price. You're dealing with a loss of remittances because people in these poorer countries go abroad. They're generally on lower paid or lower skilled jobs. They send money home. That is disrupted. And they're seeing disruptions across the food supply chain, from the production of food to the distribution of food to their ability to pay for it. So you see this multiple convergence of many crises. If you're in other parts of Africa now or Southeast Asia, you realize they're now dealing with a locust pestilence, so that, which is a real threat to global food security. The locusts and the pandemic are not directly related, but they're happening together. And this is intensifying an already deep problem. And we'll see it in our own societies, where in the United States, the crisis has exposed vulnerabilities, both in terms of how many people are in the richest country on earth, live in such precarious circumstances. And I hope not offending anybody, but a pretty dysfunctional political response. But part of the dysfunctionality of the political response and the growing polarization is a consequence of the financial crisis back in 2007 and 8 and how we responded to it. So you see this interaction of more and more crises, and even as we head into the uncertain economic effects of the coronavirus and its follow-on effects, we know that we're in a world where we're more likely to get climate change shocks, breadbasket failures, when already there's a food crisis. And we know that farmers this year in many parts of the world are going to be losing, because of the fall in income, they may not be able to plant. Thereby, they're generating a problem in food security for next year. They're compounding problems. We know that increasing global tensions are likely to generate further tensions, and we also kind of generally understand that when societies are stressed, when they're dealing with economic and social crises, often you're more likely to get state failure, revolutions, or war. So there's pretty good correlations between global food prices, or local global food prices, and outbreaks of social unrest, which is understandable. If food prices rise and you're at the very edge because you're already dealing with other problems, it becomes a tipping point where people have to go onto the streets and say, we can't survive. So what we're kind of entering into is this world of more and more crises. And the thing about each time you deal with a crisis is the effects become non-linear. And that means that each hit becomes harder to deal with than the last one. So, for example, if I take, the impact on you, if I take your first $100 or your last $100, is very different. Same measured price, the impact is totally different. It's even more different if when I take your last $100, you're dealing with a lost job, the government can't support you because it's already overwhelmed dealing with other crises, and your kid is ill, and your rent is overdue. In other words, you can cross a tipping point where disaster comes. So that is non-linearity, and that's the same for society. You can lose resilience. So, it's like having money in the bank, or a country being able to access debt markets. If crises go on, that capacity declines, and it becomes even more vulnerable to the next shock. You see it in emergency response. In the United States, there's more and more talk of, well, if we're dealing with the pandemic and there's a major hurricane, which we think this year is more likely going to be a very strong and powerful hurricane season, partially due to the effects of climate change. Having to deal with both of those multiplies the complexity, because you bringing lots of people, as you would have normally done, into places to protect them, but sports stadia where you put down beds, etc., becomes even more problematic, because are you going to be spreading COVID? So we see the sort of accumulation of things where multiple hits, you lose resilience, you also lose your ability to adapt. And this is one of the important things where we start to think about risk, why we're in a new risk world. When we say, there's lots of talk about the Green New Deal, well, here's the thing. One is, in a sense, it's a great explanation of, our predicament. Joseph Tainter talked about, complexity growth as a response to society dealing with problems. So what was the problem we're dealing with? Climate change. Now's the time, a Green New Deal. But of course, when you build renewable infrastructure, that costs resources. It costs waste. It's also built on the complex infrastructure of complex civilization. You can pay for it because you're selling something else somewhere else. It requires vast supply chains. It requires critical infrastructures. It requires state stability. It requires a relative amount of economic stability. So when we say we want to do a Green New Deal, one part of it is saying that, firstly, is more resources. By definition, you're making things, you're building things. It's not just the thing itself, is that thing is an emergent property of a complex, organized, integrated global system. So you're adding this, and when you say we want to keep doing it, what you're presupposing is the trajectory going forward of the system is integrated enough and stable enough that you can keep building and rolling out your green infrastructure. So in a sense, when you do that, and you're just saying more green infrastructure, it assumes global stability. It requires it is a necessary part. Likewise, when we think, and this is again about, I'm using the green ideas because it seems like we're responding to a problem, but we often see it in a very narrow way. We could say, well, what about our wasteful flights? We don't need tourism. We don't need to travel around the world burning jet fuel. We can do things locally. This is like extravagant. Let's give up this. It's not necessary. Well, it's only not necessary. It's incredibly necessary if, say, you're a waiter in Egypt and you don't have great state support. It's your income. It might be trivial to you, worth giving up for the climate, but to somebody in Egypt who works in a resort, it's critical income. Even more so because as a whole, it's part of foreign exchange, hard currency earnings that gives its currency the strength to bid for food on global markets because Egypt is food insecure. And that becomes even more critical as the risks to global food prices and security rise. So what we see is these complex interdependencies we try and solve problems by adding more, and we try and, trying to reduce in other parts cause other problems. So in a sense, this is again an example of a predicament. So how are we going to look at all of this simply? Because there's so many interactions, so many things. Well, you can see the old graph there. Well, what's happening is we see in the yellow and then the red distribution. So at the bottom, impact or GDP, on the side, likelihood. We see there's more things hitting our economies and societies. So that means, our welfare or our GDP, I know they're not directly correlated, there's some correlation, but not direct, but this is a simplification, is shifting. We're less likely to get higher growth. The other thing is there's more interactions. More interactions mean more surprises. The difference when we sort of say, well, if you get more fires, so like the ones we saw in Australia or California in the last year, the difference between a big fire doing X amount of damage and the fire just moving slightly. so that it starts to undermine the water or the grid is immense. So small differences in the fire movement can have vastly different economic and social consequences. And having more things interacting means that, you know, our ability to predict the curve, there's more and more interaction, gets harder and harder. And the fatter that curve gets is a measure of uncertainty, of the we do not know. And if the post-war period, which you see the nice one, the black one there, is a period of stability, of a distribution, of predictability, we're now have entered an age of the distribution of risk is moving. You also see at the other end, the risk of large-scale systemic failure is growing. So we're in a world then of transforming risk. Things are becoming more unpredictable. Things are, on average, going to get worse and worse. And there is a growing risk of systemic failure that could be due to the financial system collapsing. It could be due, which becomes more likely as there are more constraints on economic growth and volatility, etc. It's already vulnerable. It could be due to war. And again, we say war, we're so globally interconnected. If the heart goes to war with the lungs, even the toe is in danger. You know, so yeah, this is part of being in a global system. We're so interdependent. So, you know, we see this transformation of risk, and we've got to say to ourselves, so this is kind of where we're coming to our conclusions. You know, with this transformation of risk, how do we make decisions? Because we're losing predictability. Yeah. And yeah, when we want to plan to 2050, you're sort of saying, look, 2050 as you think mightn't happen. You want to roll out renewable energy to 2030, 40. You may not have the stability in the system to do it. You may not have the earnings to do it. There are countries now that could import last year the ability to say put in lots of green infrastructure, but this year they won't be able to. So we're going to say, how do we approach it? Okay, well, we're not ever saying exactly what's going to happen. You know, other futures are possible. So if we go back up, so you'll still see we could have 3% growth in the diagram. Still probability there, a few percent growth. This is that we're interested in the shape of the diagram here. So they're not precise in terms of, we don't know exactly how they look, but you know, there is potential, you know, we could have a better future, but the thing is downside risks are growing. We've learned that in general, warning people about risks they haven't experienced is probably not all going to move the world. So we've known about pandemics. Indeed, I've been in meetings over the years and discussions over the years saying we need to look after the issues of preparedness for pandemics, and people will sometimes get it, but yeah, they don't have the, you know, they can recognize a problem, but the gap between being able to take action, being recognizing the problem, taking action is too wide. And we're also, you know, we're take a lot of cues from others. So there's a great sort of bias towards not doing things. Now this is probably shifting because, say, this pandemic is giving people a lesson in a large scale risk. But you know, generally we're not good. And secondly, or well, we'll leave that there. So what do we need to do? Well, there's two things you can sort of do. One is, you know, prepare for collapse of large-scale systemic failure. So I generally actually don't use the word collapse. I talk about large-scale systemic failure. It could be local and reversible, or it could be global and irreversible. But in general, we saw that interconnection between the financial system, critical infrastructure, supply of goods or services. They're interdependent. If you pull out one of them, the others will all fall. That's what the interdependence means. So that means that diverse types of stresses, financial collapses, major damage to the grid, the accumulating impacts of climate and environmental and social stresses, all of these things, if the stresses and shocks are big enough, they will shut down the whole system. The whole thing will collapse. And that means the simple outcome of that is there's a shutdown of in a flow of goods and services. So rather, if you're in a preparedness mindset, you're not thinking of, oh, what will climate change do? Or, oh, what will financial collapse or how it'll happen? You're just saying we're preparing for all of them because we're preparing for what happens if there is a shutdown in flow of goods and services. The thing is, because the probability is rising, you sort of say, well, okay, we need to structure this because we may not have 20, 30, 40 years to prepare. Something may happen in 6 months. Imagine 6 months ago saying we need to prepare for a pandemic in the next 6 months. People would have said, this is crazy, you know, this is off your head. Now we're saying, well, that would have been probably a bit too late. So we need a sort of multi-level preparedness. So let's say I told you there was going to be a large-scale systemic failure in 6 months. What would you do? Let's say I told you you had 6 years. Yeah, what could you do now that would prepare you for? And if I said, what could you do in 15 years? So you need to do all of those at once, that sort of planning and preparedness. So obviously, you know, if it's in 6 months, your planning is going to be very basic, but, you know, societies need to be able to start thinking like that. But really, we're a world that I've called the axial stress, which is just growing uncertainty. The system isn't collapsed, but it's uncertainty. There's more shocks and stresses. It gets harder and harder to maintain the things we take for granted. There's more social and economic stress and uncertainty. So one of the things we've to realize is, you know, that, you know, because we're in a moving distribution, the window for action is closing or maybe closing. Now, there's ways we can actually measure this, but that's another story. The windows for action may be getting narrower. That means we need to start doing stuff now. Okay? And one way to do that is use our crisis now in a way that will make us better prepared for a bigger crisis in future. So one of the things I'm working on saying, you know, if there is going to be large scale unemployment coming out of this crisis, how could we use, using monetary finance, a universal basic income or other things to build effectively a resilience core? Just employ large swathes of the population to work in food security, nature, regeneration, resource and local preparedness mapping, all sorts of things. So in that way, you're dealing with a current potential crises from the coronavirus. You're building social capital because, you know, it's really destructive for people if they're not working, especially if it goes on, which it may. So in this sense, they can be the vanguard of something. We need to build resilience. Now, resilience gets a bit thrown around. So we can make our grid more resilient, and that's an important thing, or make our water systems more resilient. But we also have to think of basic societal resilience. So what if we lose the water systems? What if the ones that we have? What do we do then? So again, like the time at multiple levels, we also need to think of resilience at multiple levels. And you kind of work through as best you can all of them. And that is, you know, again, if we can do it, it's good, is that there will be stimulus coming. One hopes that, you know, central banks and governments, I mean, for the moment, there isn't a constraint on printing money to do things. So you're sort of saying, well, what should you spend it on? And here would be where I'd kind of disagree with the Green New Deal people and say, build out renewable energy, because you may be just putting stuff in a grid that if there is a major crisis and there's a major drop in demand, it may be just hanging there or even have to be turned off because it's destabilizing the grid. Far better to put your renewable energy and focus it on what is most important, which could be, you know, what happens if the grid goes down? Can we still run the water and the sanitation in our cities using renewable energy? So it becomes that sort of, you know, you prioritize. So in summation, there is a very good chance that I think we've probably passed the limits to growth. Can never be certain, but that this crisis will be very difficult. It will interact with other crises. Those crises will sort of feed back and hit us harder, undermine some of our ability to adapt, bring new pressures, and we're going to have to try and deal with it. We may pick up the economy again. I'm not sure if it will ever get to the level of activity it got at the end of last year. Maybe it will, but I don't think if it does, it won't last for long. Our conception of risk, where that road at the beginning was assumed, where the patterns of the future in some way were created and became intuitive due to the patterns of the past, starts to break away, falls from beneath our grasp. And in some way, we're going to have to find a way to deal with that. We can deal with it together and as constructively as possible. But one way or another, whether we like it or not, you know, we're interdependent. We're interdependent through global systems. And we are interdependent with nature. The more effort we spend tearing at both each other and of the rest of the world, the more we will undermine our capacity to adapt to the changing reality. So I'm going to leave it with that. And if there are questions, or if anybody wants to look at my website, which is Korowicz Human Systems, you'll see some of the things I'm up to and what I've been doing. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, really, really useful. I took a ton of notes, and we have one viewer online who also took a ton of notes. But actually, I have a nature calls, and so what I suggest is, are you willing to, for 5 to 10 minutes, just give us your background? Like, how did you come to be a humans systems analyst who was able to come to having this sort of a perspective? And since you've already told me this, sort of, you can just like summarize while I go and come back, because we are live.
Okay. Well, I won't go into the whole story, but you'll find it actually in an interview with me on the website. But my background is as a physicist, and for really about 12, 13 years, I've been first worked through what was known as the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability, working on things like peak oil, learning about monetary systems, etc. And since then, I've been looking at all sorts of systemic risks and vulnerabilities, from how financial systems collapse through supply chains, to pandemics, to integrated risk and how one looks at it. And up until recently, I was director of risk and response at the Geneva Global Initiative. And there, what we were trying to do is say, well, if we are going into a period of crises, what sort of things can we do, and what sort of things can we learn from governments, organizations, people in civil society organizations that would be useful if we enter a period of stabilisation or large-scale systemic shocks. So that has included everything from looking at contingency agencies, particularly the Nordics and Baltics, who are very good at whole of society preparedness, where they realize that, you know, unlike the old days where, you know, you have a specialist, blue light services, military, whatever, if there's a crisis, they come in, fix the problem and disappear again. It's an acknowledgement we're an increasingly risky world, and all of society, citizens, the private sector, need to be able to play a role. And rather than being episodic, it needs to be something that becomes part of society. And the great thing is, you know, when these things might seem overwhelming, is people are already doing it. They say the Nordics and the Baltics are well ahead and moving in some of these things. And then learning about who's got ways of understanding or exploring or helping educate us as to these sort of risks. And there I could direct people to the Electric Infrastructure Security Council, and they're organizing a big exercise that everybody can take part in, whether you're a major organization or a government or an individual or a family or a community, that will be starting in September. But go and have a look at the site. It's called it's the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. You can have a look at EarthX on that, EarthX 2020. And that would be a great thing if you're interested in some of the ideas and thinking, how could I respond in whatever role or institution or family to some sort of shock? This would be a great thing to have a look at. So yeah, so I've been exploring all of those things. And here comes Aaron, so I can be off the hook.
Okay. Thank you. So now I have a question. Can you go back a slide, please? What is the red?
The red, well, this is the changing shape of the risk profile. So you see the impact, or GDP, on the bottom, the likelihood. And it's the distribution, it's the change in distribution of risk.
I'm not sure what the axes are. Is one of these time?
No. Look, the bottom is impact. So remember, risk is likelihood times impact. So the impact, the further to the left you go towards systemic failure, the greater the impact, negative impact. And the higher up, on the y-axis, the greater the likelihood.
Okay, wait a second. So the impact to the GDP is red. You have a plus. I'm trying to figure out what you're.
It's all, like, it's red, it's yellow, and black.
Well, let's just look at red though. So the x-axis is impact. So on all the way to the left, that is systemic failure, and all the way on the right is growth.
Is better and better. Yeah.
Okay. So the way people are looking at things now is black.
Yeah.
Okay. So right now people are looking at, so this is a projection of people's expectations for the future, but it's not really plotting it into the future. Exactly.
Well, it's not so much expectations now, it's just a schematic of what risk will look like. So why is, say, for instance,
well, let me see if I can explain it, because I think I have it. Okay. So right now, black line is what most people are perceiving. So they're thinking, hey, that plus 3% there, the economy is going to come back together. It's very likely, that's why it's so high above that. It's likely the economy is going to come back together fairly soon, maybe this year or next year or the following year, but fairly soon. We're going to be at 3%. It's very likely. And it might be higher than that, which would be to the right. It might be less than that, which is to the left. But the expectation that it's going to be like very low is very, very low. People don't expect that there's going to be a negative 5% GDP for any significant period of time. There are
well, I think they might now. I don't think they.
Well, yeah, but let's look just at black. But then people all the way in the back of their mind say, a few people say, well, you know, things could be really bad. We could have a depression. And that's your little black hump, what I think of it as your
well, the black hump is systemic failure. So a depression, you know, this is inexact, but a depression might be towards near the bottom of the black curve on the left. So
on the right. Near the plus 2%.
Yeah, that would be about 0, or just nearby, but down a bit.
So I don't know that there's actually many people that think of it in this black line, because systemic failure, I mean, I think most people don't even think of that as a risk.
Yeah.
So the line of most people's thoughts is really it's really all the way over to the right above the +3, and it's really kind of it's kind of this tall, like a pyramid above that, really.
Well, I think it's changing now. With COVID is opening people's minds to bigger shocks. But I suppose, you know, what's that schematic is doing? It's trying to put a lot of complex information to see if we can, you know, show it sort of the main things more clearly. So, you know, the thing is, the distribution is changing. It's becoming from the black to the yellow to the red. It's moving. Right. Exactly. What that means is, if you look at the highest likelihood in the yellow and the red, firstly, the likelihood it's falling. It's because part of these, but it's shifting. It's becoming less and less. So it's going to be harder and harder to get 3% growth. It's going to be more and more likely that it's going to be less due to the multiple shocks and their stresses and their interactions. But the second important thing is, look how fat the curve becomes. The curve is getting fatter and fatter as it moves, you know, so it's getting thicker. And that's a measure of uncertainty, because there's so many surprises, interactions that can happen, it becomes harder to predict.
By fatter, do you mean on the right-hand side, the red line, the red curve above the +3, it's widening out. And so people are seeing, hey, we're probably not going to get to +3. We might be at -5, -10, -20.
Yeah, you can see it's just getting wider and wider and wider. The area, the area under the hump is just getting wider, you know. So it becomes hard. It's effectively saying, you know, things are getting worse, but it's becoming harder and harder, intrinsically harder. It's not because you don't have a great model. It's just becoming like there's so many interactions through a vulnerable systems that, you know, prediction becomes harder. But you know that it's a downside tilt on GDP or, you know, more generally welfare.
Well, now I'm seeing this graph from two perspectives. There's one, which is the perspective of how people perceive the future, how each person and how collectively people perceive the future. And I was talking with several people about this week. Robert Rapier most recently yesterday, and he was talking about how the oil markets at the moment are, I mean, they're expecting, it appears for the futures, because the futures market, they're trying to decide what is the future going to be like. They seem to still have confidence. The consensus view, which is the price of the oil, is still, you know, somewhat high. It's like $30 a barrel or something. So the consensus is still pushing over near that yellow or red in kind of a consensus perspective. But this is people's expectations. And that, of course, is all over the map, depending on who the person is. You know, but there's a consensus view, and not just a consensus view, but there's a consensus view of those who are vocal, I guess you could say, who share that view. But then the other way of looking at this chart, I think, is, and they're not separated actually, but it's the reality of, as time goes on, as we move from, we're May 21st, 2020 right now, as we move from March to April to May to June, that the actual reality of the future is shifting from the black to the yellow to the red. And it's not, I mean, it is relevant what people believe, but the beliefs are going to drag behind, for most people, the actual reality. So, because people aren't, we don't have enough information to be able to say that we are at, you know, we are 1 minute from midnight, or whatever you want to use for your analogy. And so there's the actual reality of, there are unpredictable impacts. For example, there could be a solar storm. We can't predict that, and our vulnerability is so high, our anti-fragility, that a collapse would almost be inevitable at that point. Or if there was a volcanic eruption, I mean, that's really the best example, I think. I mean, you gave the example of Mount Temporal, and in the book that you and Richard and Douthwaite and others with FASTA published, Fleeing Vesuvius, I mean, that was kind of a related concept, right? Right?
Yep.
So, so I mean, I see that graph. I'm so used to looking at graphs where, you know, time is on the x-axis, that it took me a little more, and especially since you said time post World War II at the top.
So time is representing the evolution of, it's the evolution of risk in time.
This needs to really be displayed in a three-dimensional graph. Those are not easy to make for me on a computer, though. Like a 3D, like this is a topography, really, is what we're looking at. Where time, we're looking at slices in time going forward, and how the risk profile is changing as we go forward in time, based on more information coming in, and just the natural evolution of everything. Okay, so I have a lot of questions, but I don't know how much time you have available today.
Oh, well, take one or two, and
oh, they're not that kind of questions. They're much longer-winded questions. Do you have 10 minutes or 20 minutes?
Well,
or
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh, gee. $10. Okay, David, because I've got like this whole thing. But let's talk about then, if we only have 10 minutes, let's talk about analogies. Because the people who've watched this, I mean, it's a few of them are going to be able to get other people to watch this, but for the vast majority, if it's just a person watching this, they're not going to have a good analogy yet. And so we need to provide them with one. So I've come up with a list of like 7. And you can help us figure out which one is the best.
Okay.
So, what we're talking about is this complex global society, this global economy, this civilization, this super organism, this collective consciousness globally, this hive mind, this noosphere perhaps, global brain perhaps. But in any event, we're talking about this complex global society. So the analogy could be a home during a blizzard. It could be an automobile. It could be a human body or any other organism, a dog or a cat. It could be a space station in outer space. It could be an ecosystem, like an island ecosystem would be a good example. Or it could be the entire global living sphere of Earth, whatever that's called. There's a name for that. It's not the livosphere, it's a Latin term, but the living Earth sphere. So I think the one I like the best is space station, but the problem with that is people aren't familiar with that. So I think it's either got to be home, automobile, or human body. So which one is the best one for people?
Well, I must say, I find the human body, I often use that as an analogy. And I'll tell you why. Because why it's different from a car or something else is the human body is a complex system. The car isn't. Or it's a complicated system. A car, but the human body is a complex system, and a human body, because it's a complex system, has many of the properties that a civilization has. It has homeostasis. It tries to sustain itself within the buffets of temperature, or it has ways of it needs to feed itself, so it needs to sustain itself in time. It can be disrupted. I think I used examples of heart attacks or scratches, and how parts of the system can influence other parts. It's interdependent. All the bits kind of hang together. It's pretty useless if you lose a heart or a brain or a spinal cord or whatever. So I think the body is good. It's also one where we can use very direct analogies, so that that where we can look at sort of nonlinearity or compounding events. Sort of nonlinearity is, an ordered common cold is more dangerous if you're already very ill or frail. Do you know what I mean? So that's sort of a nonlinear effect. Or compounding events. If you get, compounding, see with COVID, if you already have some sort of pathology and you get COVID, your chance of dealing with it successfully is very much less. So a lot of those things, analogies, are very directly related to complex society, because they are complex systems that have worked to sustain themselves in dynamic environments, and that their integration can be disrupted. They can they have also abilities of self-repair or resilience, to a certain degree. So if I cut myself or whatever, like the global economy, if there's, if you think of an example, think of past risk. If there is a disruption, there is a tsunami in Southeast Asia in 2011, was it, or Fukushima, these sort of earthquake in Pakistan or whatever, these sort of shocks that happen to part of the global system. And what happens is, the system, the impacted area has some resilience, but the external part also provides resilience to allow the damaged or hurt part of the global system to in some way recover or re-equilibrate. And that's kind of like the body does as well. If we're hit by something or hurt by something, our body works to build, restore, protect.
Okay, let's, can you take the slide down?
Very much that's our, yep.
Okay, so let's go with the human body as the analogy, because that's the analogy I usually use anyway, although I think it's useful to look at different analogies, because no analogy is perfect, I don't think. So the human body, as an analogy to this global civilization, global economy, global civilization, the global civilization, our global economy is very much like your human body. It has systems. It has energy flows, it has matter flows, it's made of patterns, it's made of cells. In a way, humans are kind of like the cells in the global economy. Not just humans, actually, technically all the farm animals and are also, I mean, they also technically provide a function to the global economy. We know that global economies or very large scale economies have collapsed before. In fact, everyone prior to this one has collapsed or they have merged together. So for example, the East and the West have kind of integrated to the great degree. Globally, we're pretty much all one global economy. There's not really a independent island nation anywhere. Even North Korea or Cuba are not in autarkies where they're totally self-dependent. There may be some small places here and there, like a small eco-village somewhere or a small island somewhere.
I mean, when one thinks of like, you know, a tribe somewhere in the Amazon, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I often talk about the uncontacted that are in, you know, the Amazon or who are in North New Guinea or on Sentinel Island near India. So, so again, it's the human body, but I think, so now do we look at the human body as the global economy, and the human body is part of the environment or exists within the environment, right? So we exist as part of the environment, just like the tribal peoples, just like anybody out living on their own. I mean, it's possible, right, for a certain amount of time, for a lifetime, to live out on your own somewhere. Or do we use the analogy of our human body as analogous to civilization plus the actual living ecosphere of the planet? In which case, I mean, because as you showed in your one graph, this is part of, I mean, it's within, it fits within. Do you think of it more as one way or the other when you're imagining it?
Well, I mean, you know, as I usually when I'm using the body as I use the body, if I'm using it as an analogy, as to represent the complex human system. And of course, you know, that, you know, outside the body is where it gets its fuel and water and security, you know. So I just using that because it has some of the properties that you and I have mentioned.
So I've thought of, you know, there's all these past societies, complex societies. You mentioned Joseph Tainter, and the other one who has written that I'm most familiar with is Jared Diamond, who's also written on a similar concept. And I think the difference is Joe's work is focusing on how complexity, ever-growing complexity, builds fragility to the point where there's a shock, and that shock leads to collapse. Jared talks more about like what are kind of the different shocks. And when he talks about Easter Island, like he talks about how all the trees were used, and that led to a food shortage and a collapse of the ability of the land to grow food for the people. Whereas on Tikopia Island, prior to civilization visiting, they had figured out a way to live there for thousands of years with about 1,000 people. And then I'm also thinking of the collapse of the ancient Maya and the collapse of the simplification after certain global pandemics like the Black Death or the collapse of the Roman Empire. Although to a certain extent, there were collapses that were not so critical because we weren't so dependent upon the people, our ancestors in those times who might have lived there weren't as dependent. Like, I like the example of the ancient Maya, you know, it was kind of like the people were like, oh, I guess we're done with that. We're going to go back and grow our food in the forest again, because there's this whole area which has been denuded around the pyramids, like for miles and miles out. The farmlands is no good anymore. And so we're just going to go and we're going to, you know, we're going to become homesteaders again.
Yeah.
I hate that word.
Subsistence
farmers,
yeah.
So and then the other analogy, I mean, I know you're pressed for time, but and you can tell me if you think I'm way off on this, but I think of it as our own individual mortality, that just like every organism is born, lives, and dies, every complex society is born, lives, and dies, and death is a sudden thing. I mean, it's not typically this long drawn out in nature. It's typically not a long drawn out thing where you know you're going to die and it's like a year before you die. You know that you're aging. You can see that you're aging. You can see that your body's becoming less resilient. But you don't like see it like, oh, I'm going to die next week. It's not usually like that. So I guess my question is, if we're looking at the human body as an analogy and we're talking about, you know, what leads to the death of a human body, well, you could have a problem with your circulatory system. You could have a problem with you don't have food. And so, I mean, you can go for a long time without food. You know, there have been people who have fasted, like we mentioned one of your, well, we didn't mention directly, but in Ireland, when the Troubles, there was that one fellow who, I don't know his name, you would know this better than I, who went to prison and he refused to eat until he died. And I think it was about 35 days, 40 days. And that led, that kind of initiated a new phase of the Troubles. So you can go maybe with, as long as you have water, you can go maybe a month without eating, but you're becoming less and less and less and less capable of any withstanding any shock. So like any disease or anything like that. So I guess the question is, when we talk about an analogy, what age of person are we talking about? Are we talking about like a regular healthy person? Are we talking about a really elderly person? Are we talking about, or are we talking about a cancer within our bodies?
You see, I think this is where, I mean, where you needs to be careful of taking the analogy too far.
Okay.
Or to where it's not. I mean, one of the things about, you know, from how I see things is, you know, in one sense, our society has never been bigger. You know, because that's about the limits to growth and all of that. You know, you pass the limits when you've just passed your biggest, most energy intensive, most complex, most high speed, most, you know, information generating. So, you know, it's not like it's wound down. The other side is we associate collapse with complexity, but the rate of collapse, from what I can see, is a function of complexity and the speed of processes. And ours is likely to be pretty rapid, much more rapid, say, than the Roman Empire, because we're so integrated, we're so complex, and the speed of processes is so high in relative terms. So, you know, in the Roman Empire, I mean, you know, it happened over quite a long time. There's various ways of looking at it in terms of, you know, the amount of silver in coins, you know, as they sort of gradually debased the currency. But that happened over hundreds of years. And as you say, people had stuff to fall back on. So, it still had a big agricultural hinterland. It's just, the complexity of armies couldn't be sustained and all this sort of thing. So that happened over a good while. So I think, one of the differences is for us, we're unlikely to have this sort of long dwindling old age. It's likely to be relatively quick when it starts to happen. As I would see it, and kind of goes with those curves, but I haven't been explicit about it. One of the things in complex systems in nature and society that you see prior to a collapse are what have been called early warning systems. And you can look at systems, again, from all sorts of varieties they've been looked at. You can see a couple of things. One is growing volatility. Now, we said in a way that systems, as it's evolved, they like suppressing volatility because that allows them to operate. You know what I mean? We talked about growing complexity was facilitated by the system optimizing towards suppressing volatility. So one of the signs that a system is starting to fail or is near a tipping point is growing volatility. In other words, it can no longer suppress volatility. Instead, it's starting to distribute and spread shocks around. The second thing is something called critical slowing down. And if you think of small changes from, the norm, where the system is knocked a bit away from its standard path. So we can think of, say, the global financial crisis, 2007-8, that knocked growth off track. And historically, it was a very slow recovery. It didn't happen as fast as other recoveries. Why wouldn't it happen as fast? Well, this slower return is sometimes called critical slowing down. It's a sign of an early warning signal that a catastrophic systemic failure is coming. And you can see that, if you think of it, is why does that happen? Well, one is if you're hit by crises and you have less resilience and adaptive capacity, but also outside you has less support. You're going to be hit by smaller, not collapse, but hit by shocks, and your ability to recover is going to get harder. Why? Because you've less resources to put into recovery, and outside you has less resources to put into your recovery. So we've used the various examples of being hurt. If you're older and you're hit by some illness or whatever, you're often much slower in recovering. So that's also a sign. So when we saw volatility and uncertainties amid those curves spreading, that we showed. So I think, for us, it will be relatively, when it happens, will it look like we've never been healthier in one stage, because it'll be when we've used most energy and resources, when we're fastest, most complex, and then, we start to have growing volatility and destabilization, and then failure.
Okay, so two things. Number one, we're going to do a happy chapter just to make sure. And then our next time we can chat. So first, the happy chapter part. So the collapse of complex society, when Cuba stopped getting oil imports from Russia because Russia collapsed basically in '87, they had to quickly basically start growing food. Everybody started growing food, organic food, like everybody every day was tending to their gardens. And so there's a couple films about this. One's called The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil, meaning a collapse in energy imports, like almost total. They couldn't run their tractors. I mean, and that's what they had depended upon for all their food, was the tractors. And The Greening of Cuba, similar concept. It's an earlier film. So people can withstand huge shocks like this. but growing food is critical. What I'm doing, and my wife actually spends more time doing it because I'm doing this work here, is she's put in, I mean, we've had a small garden back during the 2008 era. We had a double garden, and then we kind of fell out of that. But now we're redoing the double garden, like, and she's got the raised beds, and she bought the seeds, all the seed saver, like heritage heirloom seeds. And we've got the seeds, we've got the plants, and we put in some fruit trees, and we're getting that established. We have our pantry. Normally our pantry only had like 2 weeks of food. Now it's got like 2 months of food. So we've got our pantry, and we, well, for a long time, you know, we've made sure to stock up on our cash by minimizing our expenses. So we are not currently in a debt situation, which I know a lot of people can't do. But there's other videos on this Local Future channel that people can look at for that. But practically, what people can do now, like after they watch this video, is start thinking about, where do you get your food from? Where can you get it from locally? Both from your pantry and from growing food. And everybody has at least some ability to grow food. Even if they're in an apartment, they can grow a tomato plant or something, or put a planter out. So that, and the second part, that, you know, people, all of our ancestors, all the way back, and you can imagine that some of, as Caucasians, there's many of us who, our ancestors were in the Roman collapse. I mean, and for, you know, people who still have Maya blood, their ancestors probably were part of the Maya civilization. So every single one of our ancestors has survived at least long enough to have their children survive, so that we're here. So we've been able, like as a species, as the ones of us that are here right now, the 7 billion of us or whatever, we have a string of success that reaches all the way back to the beginning of life, right? Yeah. So we can make it through this, and there's ways to do it, but we've got to be able to have our essentials, which is food is the critical one, right? We can't live without food. We have to have that energy. And so people can focus on doing that right now. You don't have to talk to anybody, you know, but then keeping in mind that that needs to be the priority, that should be where you're, not just that, but you've got to be reaching out to your neighbors, your actual physical neighbors, because your security comes from your neighbors, and your truthfulness and honesty and connection with them. So I just want to make sure to end with that, because I don't want people going off and saying, you know, we're all going to die. No. Because that's not the case. But the case is, we are all going to need to figure out, if the food system fails and it's not, the grocery stores are empty, then where are you going to get your food? And so we need to be figuring that out. And most importantly, we need to be, as we can, growing it ourselves. So now, why don't you talk about what you're doing with, if you can spare just a minute, with Ireland, as far as, because you alluded to this earlier.
Well, I am trying, so that's all I've said. No,
Yeah, but didn't you work with that When War Comes pamphlet, or you worked?
Oh no, that's, you know, I mentioned that when you were outside of the room.
Okay.
Earlier on, I mentioned a couple of those things, sort of really giving pointers to people of where.
But these were some of the pointers. I'm sure I missed some, but.
Yeah, well, I just gave one, was talking about the Nordics and the Swedes and their whole of society preparedness, that governments can and are already thinking about, you know, acknowledge first that the whole idea of, you know, dealing with civil contingencies has all of these specialists, or the military or civil, other government agencies coming down, fixing the problem and leaving. That in future, in the world we're living in, preparedness will really have to be a collective effort of citizens, private sector, faith organizations, or, you know, the variety of our things. And also, you know, I think this is always to be said as well, is that, you know, these things can be fun. These things can be challenges. These can be new people. These, they're, all of these things can exist together. They don't. It doesn't know. But we just need to get moving. So one, I gave the example of whole of society preparedness, and that they're already doing it as a way to say, it's not airy fairy. It's out there. It's being worked upon. And then the second thing I did was to try and get people to have a look at the Electric Infrastructure Security Council website, because they're running EarthX 2020, which is an exercise for a big shock that you can play as family, as community, as government, as political infrastructure provider, or whatever. So that's something that you can practically do. It begins in September the 1st, but you can have a look at it now. That's the Electric Infrastructure Security Council.
That
so
sounds like fun.
Yeah, it will be fun.
Potentially, if you can relax and be present and not be thinking about the future too much.
Yeah.
Okay, so
listen, I've got to
yep.
The road.
Can we schedule a Q&A for this? Just a Q&A?
Yeah.
A week from today or 2 weeks from today?
Yeah,
or?
I say 2 weeks from today, if anybody wants to. As I said, my website is www.Korowicz Human Systems. So you'll see things there, and I can do a Q&A in 2 weeks at this time.
Okay, so let me announce that now then. So we're talking about June the 4th, 2020. That would be 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, US, which is 1400 UTC, right? So, and we'll do the same sort of thing. We'll come on live, and so be available. I mean, we might be delayed a minute if I have to take care of the kids or something, but so that's that'll be Thursday, June the 4th, 2020, 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, US, 1400 UTC.
Okay, brilliant.
This has been outstanding. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Aaron. Have a good day.
Have a great 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to our next chat.
2 weeks again. Take care. Bye now.
So I stayed on the line just a second after David because I want to do my reflection now while I'm thinking about it. But in 2 weeks, we'll be able to get a lot more into this. So I don't know how much I want to share of this right now, but let me just look. And I appreciate the people there. There was a person online that was giving lots of ideas and stuff. And so I appreciate that. Oh, right. So I think I might do a blog on this later after I have a bit of time to process it, because I am also on the line today at 2 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time with Gail Tverberg. And so if you're watching this, you're probably watching it in the future, and you can look back at that talk as well and see how they're related to one another. If you you can share this video with whoever you want. If you could press the thumbs up, that would be really cool, because I sometimes don't know how many people appreciate content like this. And if you do, that's great. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. If you haven't got notifications, all notifications, email notifications, set that up. Put comments in the comments. And yeah, so, and stay tuned to the Local Future channel. And we're all in this together. We can make it. It's going to be an interesting challenge. This is like the hero's journey right now that we're all going through. So chin up, and we're in it together, and take care. And we'll see you next time.